What I have is compiled a slide set to walk through some of these really big components related to graduate school and genetic counseling. We'll have time for question and answers at the end, but certainly you're welcome to drop questions in the chat, or if there's something that you want to ask live, you should have the ability to unmute yourself, and you're welcome to do so. And I'm happy to answer questions that way too. So this is part one of a 5-part series that will take place over the next couple of months. And I know that there are a lot of questions out there about aspects of preparation for applications. And so I really wanted to start sort of at this square one, this perhaps the most important question and the foundational question: am I ready for graduate school? It might sound silly, but it's a question that actually gets glossed over, and not thinking about the question or not exploring the question can really lead to some difficulties once people get into programs. And we have seen students sort of in the history of time who have ended up needing to change course in the middle of a program. Certainly we're not hoping for that for anybody. So hopefully this will help lay the groundwork. So we're going to talk about, just as a big overview, we're going to talk about some considerations for graduate school in general, and then focus in on graduate school and genetic counseling. We'll talk about the programmatic landscape. So what are, or where are the genetic counseling programs in North America? A little bit about the admissions process, because it's different than any other master's degree program in the country. We'll focus in on some of the AGCPD match information. Some of that you may have already come across, and then wrap up with some questions for self-reflection, sort of moving forward for yourself in this process. It feels important to me to start with a really quick disclaimer here. Everything that you're going to hear and see from this point forward is really sort of opinions and perspectives that have been derived from many years of working in the field, as well as working in admissions processes at more than one institution. I cannot guarantee admission or enrollment for anybody by following these steps. So this is really more of a framework to consider as you move through the process. It's certainly not the only way. It's not the only consideration. And it should be, I guess, considered as just one of the ways that you can think about this. Okay, so ultimately, readiness for graduate study is much more comprehensive than just completing your undergraduate work, and there are a lot of factors to consider. I wanted to start with graduate school in general before talking about the specific and unique components for genetic counseling, because really anybody considering graduate studies should be assessing at least these primary components. So the first is your academic history. Starting again right at the ground level, have you completed the degree requirements that you need to? Have you completed them for your undergraduate degree that you're already working on? Are you planning to complete them within a time frame that would allow you to apply to graduate school within the time frame of the graduate programs? And I'll talk a little bit more about how that applies to genetic counseling in a second. Have you completed whatever coursework is necessary for higher level study in that selected discipline? So some people may have completed lower level courses, but not upper level courses at the time of application. And that's something that you should consider in the scope of your application overall. And sort of beyond that sort of simple checkbox of completion, when you look at your transcript, what sorts of classes have you taken that fall into different categories? So what's the breadth of your transcript? What are your classes that fall into the sciences? What are your classes that fall into components like psychology or sociology or public health or many others? Does it seem like the courses that you have on your transcript will translate into a career in genetic counseling? And sometimes it's a tricky question to answer. It might seem simple, but sometimes it's a little bit more complicated. So you're welcome to talk to an academic advisor at an undergraduate institution, but you can also talk to genetic counseling programs to gather some insight on what they are looking for and sort of what's valuable. Prerequisites are another sort of direct question. If you are applying to a program that has prerequisites, have you completed them? How many have you completed? Have you completed all of them? Have you completed one of them? How many will you have completed at the time of application? Although many places will accept prerequisites sort of by the time of matriculation or enrollment, remember that if you don't submit a grade associated with a prerequisite, it can't be reviewed as a part of your transcript. So there's a little bit of information that sort of remains unseen by an admissions committee if those prerequisites aren't completed. There are many different types of graduate programs that require standardized testing. That's really widely variable in genetic counseling, and I'll talk a little bit more about that. A financial assessment's a really important one. It can be really difficult to work while completing a graduate program, particularly for programs that are full-time programs, as all genetic counseling programs are, or programs that occur during the standard business day, which means that it's more difficult in terms of flexibility for scheduling work. So, doing this assessment and asking yourself, are you in a place financially where you can support going to school and having maybe minimal work opportunities for however long the program is? And last but certainly not least is all the other aspects of your life. So, are you in a place where you can focus on your graduate school studies? Are there things you want to do like travel? Do you need or want to gain work experience in something? Do you have family responsibilities that are going to draw a big component or portion of your attention for a particular period of time? And does that line up with entry to graduate school for you? Graduate school, particularly in genetic counseling, takes a lot of time and energy and focus. And so if you have, certainly we can't account for everything. We know that things happen that we can never account for. And if you're, asking yourself this question going in, then you might be able to mitigate some of the components that you might know about at the outset and sort of change your course accordingly. There are tons of resources out there about preparing for graduate school in general, but there are very, very few that are specific to genetic counseling. And we're trying to work on that. We're trying to sort of pull back the curtain one event at a time and hopefully increase understanding across the board. So again, if you have a specific question about the process of genetic counseling, like graduate school for genetic counseling, please feel free to drop it in the chat, and I'm happy to review and talk through those. So obviously, as a graduate program, there's some overlap between graduate school and genetic counseling and graduate school in general. But I think in practicality, applying to genetic counseling programs or being in a genetic counseling program is more like a specialty program like law or medicine. Even though the programs are often 21 months long, so 2 academic years in the summer in between, that's sort of the most common length. There's a lot that occurs in that time frame. And so I think sometimes it can feel like a 3-year program, and some of the requirements at entry are specific and can sort of feel like going into a medical program or special programs that have extended timeframes like physical therapy and law. So the process piece is unique in a lot of ways. There are certainly specific requirements academically. Those are common prerequisites. There are some that you can expect to see, things like advanced genetics. And we'll talk a little bit more about prerequisites in more detail in sort of the next session. But in general, you want to explore the prerequisites for the programs that you're interested in because they might not be the same. So you can expect to see a genetics course as a prerequisite, often biochemistry and generally statistics. Those are pretty common prerequisites, but some programs also require embryology courses, or some may have medical terminology courses or intro to psychology courses as prerequisites. And those are not necessarily universal. So you'll want to see, of the programs you're looking at, what are the prerequisites for that? And I think it's also important to consider, we're saying biochemistry is a prerequisite. But in order to take biochemistry, you'll need to take 2 semesters of general chemistry and at least 1 semester of organic chemistry in order to get to that biochemistry course. So even though biochemistry is listed as the prerequisite, there may be many other courses in sequence that you need to follow in order to get to that. Depending on your undergraduate, that might be the same for things like genetics. And generally statistics you can take either through departments of math, but also through biology or psychology. We've even seen anthropology and sociology statistics. So there's a lot of ways that you can access that. Experiences are also something that genetic counseling graduate programs review. And this comes out through your resume and sort of CV review. And again, we'll go into a whole lot of depth about that. But there are often common experiences that graduate programs are looking for. And that includes exposure to the field of genetic counseling, things like advocacy work or crisis counseling, sometimes research or laboratory work, and sort of other components of leadership and education, sort of all of these branches of the components that come together within the field of genetic counseling. So when, when you're considering your readiness for genetic counseling programs, take a look at your own materials. When you look at your transcript and you look at your prerequisites, have you met all of the things that you need to before submitting an application? And that answer is going to be really different for every single person. You may also want to consider taking a class depending on how long it's been since you graduated from your undergraduate. So we review undergraduate transcripts, but if it's been, 5, 10 years, 15 years since you were in undergrad, you may want to take a course or two and sort of demonstrate academic achievement now, and also sort of brush up on some topics that maybe you didn't cover as a part of your undergraduate transcript. I don't think anybody should feel the need to repeat courses specifically that they took, but the idea would be to sort of expand upon your background information and knowledge. So as I'm guessing you're aware, the field of genetic counseling and programs are considered to be highly competitive nationally. I put some data in here that's available through the NMS website, and we'll talk about NMS in a bunch of detail. And this information is released annually after each match cycle. So this last cycle that concluded in April of 2021 had over 2,000 individual applicants for 553 positions. So that's the most applicants we've ever had that we've been able to sort of clearly document. And it's also the most positions that have ever been offered at any given time. So I don't have these numbers here to sort of be scary or intimidating in any way, but instead, what I'm hopeful is that it will help you to understand why it's so important to be prepared for your application process. So in terms of experiences, sort of one of the common threads is that experiences are highly valued. Given this gap between the available training spots and interested applicants, I think programs feel a particular pressure to ensure that anybody who enrolls in one of those spots is truly interested in the field of genetic counseling for what it is, not using it as a stepping stone to something else, or not using it as something that is sort of like a fallback, but saying, I know what genetic counseling is, I'm interested in it, and this is how I know that. So almost everybody will be looking for that as a part of your application, and will be looking for that information from you sort of in your own words. We get a lot of questions about whether or not it's an advantage or a disadvantage to take time between undergrad and graduate programs. And honestly, there's no single answer to that question. And my response typically relates to experiences. If you feel like you've been able to get experiences, you've been able to complete the vast majority of your academic components during your undergrad, then go ahead and apply. There's sort of no specific advantage or disadvantage to anybody in either cohort. So that's something that's very specific to you. And if you'd like more guidance on that, I would recommend speaking to some of the programs that you intend to apply to. I wanted to just take a couple minutes and orient to genetic counseling programs overall. So there are currently 55 ACGC accredited programs in North America. There are 51 in the US and 4 in Canada. I have specifically said here that these programs are ACGC accredited because you have to graduate from an ACGC accredited program in order to sit for the board exam after graduation. And you have to sit for the board exam and pass the board exam in order to become a certified genetic counselor. So you'll graduate from your graduate program with a degree in genetic counseling, but you need to pass the board exam in order to be a certified genetic counselor. There's information on all of those programs on the ACGC website, and I have the link there, and I can share the link also through the chat. But it will sort of outline for you where all of the programs are. And in our next session, we'll talk about how to sort of sort through all of those programs, because what I found is that the more programs you look at, the more they seem alike. So it can be sometimes tricky to just start with that big list of 51. There are three categories of accreditation that you'll see. The first one is full accreditation. That is an 8-year designation. There's also accredited, new program you'll see, and that means that a program is approved, but it has not yet been functioning for more than 4 years. So when a new program comes online at year 4, they go through this sort of self-study process that is used in accreditation, and then they can be granted full accreditation at that point. Probational accreditation, and thankfully there are no programs at this time that have probational accreditation, means essentially that a program is accredited or had accreditation, but the national organization has identified some significant issues with the program that are requiring additional attention. So even though we go through this process every 8 years, we do have to submit information annually that speaks to how we are upholding the standards. And so if there's a big change somewhere, sometimes programs can end up in that probational accreditation with that designation. So the standards are what are used to determine accreditation. Those standards are broken up into 4 domains and are based on what's called the practice-based competencies. And the practice-based competencies are essentially the minimum competencies that all graduating students must have to be considered fit for entering the profession. All of this is public information. You can access it. You can see all the details of the practice-based competencies and the standards. I'm not going to go through them here because they can, there's a lot there, but you're certainly more than welcome to look at them at any time. And ultimately, this is to both our benefit and value as well as ultimately that of the patients, right? You want to make sure that somebody who is going to be providing healthcare is coming from a place that has at least a core set of minimum standards and competencies to follow. So again, you're welcome to explore any of that at any time. So when we talk about this sort of shared standards, right, all programs that are accredited have shared standards. What does that look like in practicality, right? A lot of people will ask, well, how do I tell the difference between programs, or what does this program have that other programs don't have? Well, ultimately, the curriculum is not a great differentiator, right? If we're all teaching to the same standards, then looking at curriculum pages or course titles, you're going to see a significant amount of overlap. Especially because we're talking about essentially meeting all of these standards in less than 2 years. So the majority of the curriculum is going to be the same. And frankly, I think that's a good thing. As a consumer, you would want to sort of be secure in your knowledge that no matter where your genetic counselor graduated from, they have the same base knowledge as any other counselor. So again, we're going to discuss this in much more detail, but one tip for differentiating programs is to look at where programs are housed. And I have housed here in quotations. And that means where they are in an institution's organizational structure. So some programs are housed in medical schools, some are in departments of biology, some are in departments of genetics, some are in schools of public health. At UNCG, we are in the School of Health and Human Sciences. And so what that means for us, sort of, again, from a practical standpoint, is that we take a really multifaceted approach that is very sort of health and community focused. So of course, there's going to be molecular content. Of course, there's going to be psychological content. You're going to get that no matter where you go. But what we're doing is we're looking at this from sort of through this lens of a holistic approach, right? So how do all these factors come together to impact an individual, to impact a family, to impact a community? Everything in life is multifaceted. And so we work very hard to provide a holistic approach, both to training as well as a view on the field of genetic counseling, to really try to be representative of that. You'll see that what this means is that the lens that's applied to the curriculum varies often, and sometimes where programs are housed can be sort of the first tip for that. So for example, if a program is in a school of public health, you can expect to see more of a public health thread throughout the curriculum than you might at a program that's housed in a department of biology. So I want to talk about admissions overall, because as I mentioned, it's a little bit different than standard graduate schools that are not genetic counseling. So from a big picture view, Genetic counseling has universal admissions. That means that in general, we follow the same timeline. So applications are submitted to individual programs, and those due dates vary, and I'll talk a little bit more about that. But in general, sort of this stepwise process. So applications get submitted to individual programs. Those applications are reviewed and interview offers are made. Those interviews will look different based on different programs, but you have to interview somewhere in order to enroll. So those interviews get completed. Again, this is where there's a wide variety of differences between programs. So some programs have partial day interviews, some have full day interviews, some will have phone interviews or sort of short video interviews, some will have all distance or sort of all remote interviews, some have in-person, some will have hybrid at this point. So that part looks different. Some are also individual, sometimes there's group components, sometimes there's written components, there's sort of a wide variety of what interviews look like because they're conducted by the individual programs. But after interviews, rank lists are generated both by the programs and people who interviewed, and the results are revealed to all applicants and programs at the same time. And I'm going to talk about this also in more detail in a few slides. So the details of an application are specific to the program. So you're going to find this information through the individual program websites. And all of that you can link to through ACGC or AGCPD. Those are detailed requirements are often on institution and program websites, and then you would submit an application directly to each individual program that you want to apply to. However, no matter where you apply, generally, you'll be asked to supply transcripts for review, a resume or CV, letters of reference, and a personal statement. There are some programs that require standardized test scores in the form of a GRE, and there are other programs, I think at this point, this sort of statistical majority of programs are not requiring standardized test scores, but that's something that would be on their website specifically. So although there are common components, there are also components where programs differ. So from a prerequisite standpoint, as I mentioned earlier, some programs will require things like introductory psychology, sometimes even advanced psychology, sometimes embryology courses or others. There may be some differences in experiential requirements. And for example, all programs are going to look for some interfacing with genetic counseling. Where have you interfaced with the field and in what way? But some programs have sort of hours that they're looking for. Some will say, oh, we're looking for X number of hours or Y number of hours of exposure. And other programs don't. We don't have any sort of minimum or maximum requirement in terms of hours of genetic counseling exposure. So it's a little bit harder for me to speak to that more specifically, but I have heard that there are programs that have sort of these hour targets that they're looking for. There might also be things like advocacy work or crisis work, like I mentioned earlier, where there's an assessment of, have you completed any additional training? Do you have exposure to populations that are different than you, and what does that look like? Individual programs sometimes have additional submissions. Those might be things like videos or written prompts or writing samples, things like work you've done at various other points. Those are usually shared through supplemental sections or different components. But again, all those details will be on individual program websites. And then also the due dates vary widely. So even though there's this universal process and universal timeframe, the individual program due dates are, they range from December 1st, sometimes even to as late as March. So if you start your looking later, you might find that there are some programs you are not able to apply to because that deadline has passed. So as a spoiler alert, our application deadline is December 15th. It is a little bit on the earlier side for programs. It's not the earliest, but it's on the earlier side. Some go into January, and again, maybe sometimes even March. So what I want to talk about that's like really specifically unique to genetic counseling is the match. And we know that it's unique because we're the only master's degree program in the United States that participates in this form of admissions process. It is administered by an organization called the National Matching Service, or NMS. And that is totally separate from any individual application to a program. So in order to participate in genetic counseling admissions, you need to register for the match through NMS, and you also need to submit applications to the programs that you want to apply to. So the overall process of match, this is very similar if you're familiar with residency match or fellowship match. It's the same process and probably also run by the same organization. So after interviews, programs and applicants submit rank lists by priority, and then an algorithm is run to determine the best possible match between the programmatic rank list and the individual applicant rank list. There's an additional information on the NMS website. There's also a great short video that helps to understand how the algorithm works. We've been using this process since 2018. And it's been phenomenal, honestly. I think sometimes when people hear about it for the first time, it can sound very stressful, but in many ways, it's actually much cleaner, and I think an overall lower stress process than the old system of sort of phone calls and wait lists and things. So there are no wait lists. When you receive your information, you know if you have matched or not. So the ranking and sort of how the match works is by tracks, and the tracks are specific and unique to each program. They are primarily defined by financial components, and that's what you use to rank. So as an example, and then I'll sort of expand on this example, track number 13111, and in quotes is sort of the title as it would appear on the NMS website, 2-year Master's of Science program, graduate assistantship and tuition waiver, is one of our tracks that we've had in the past. That track is open to out-of-state students because it comes with an out-of-state tuition waiver, which turns the out-of-state tuition into in-state tuition for the first year of the program, regardless of residency. Because it's a graduate assistantship, we anticipate about 8 hours per week of work with the program, and a minimum $4,000 stipend for that in the first year. And then this is like additional detail, all out-of-state students are eligible to apply for in-state tuition in their second year, which dramatically reduces the cost. So the number of tracks is also unique to each program. So historically, we've had 3 tracks. Some programs have only 1 track, some programs have 5 tracks. It really depends on the different financial offerings that a program has. This information can be a little bit harder to come by prior to submitting an application. I know for us, part of that is because we are always working to secure additional funding. And so any additional funding that we have to offer, we'll have in place by the time of interviews, but we may not have it to be sort of publicly available in, at this point in time. So if there's something you're particularly interested in, again, we absolutely always encourage you to reach out to programs and ask for some of that clarification and look at websites. So when you go through and you interview at a place, you learn about the match tracks and however many they are, and then that's what you'll use to complete your rank list. So you can complete the rank list by whatever your priority is. If your priority is, hey, I really want to go to this program, let's say, for example, you really want to go to UNCG, then you could rank all 3 of our tracks, 1, 2, 3, whatever the priority is for you. And then your 4th track would be for another program. And whether you stack their tracks or, you are prioritizing different financial options from different organizations really just depends on what works for you. This process, your rank list, is all completely private. It is not shared. It is not shared with, it's only shared with whoever you share it with. It's not shared with programs. No one is going to know what you put in your rank list other than you and whoever you tell. So we always encourage people to be truly honest. If there's a school you wouldn't want to go to, you shouldn't rank that school. If there's a track that you couldn't accept because financially it wouldn't work for you, you shouldn't rank that track. And part of the reason for that is because the results of the match are binding. So when you receive that match result, whatever the result is considered to be binding. So if you match to a school, you need to go to that school. For people who either attempt to withdraw from that or do withdraw from that, there is an assessment and evaluation of whether or not there was any form of misconduct, like if somebody was misled or if there was something that could have been accounted for. And then there is actually a disciplinary committee that reviews that and decides if somebody can participate in the match in the future. So it's so much easier to just not rank a track or a program if it doesn't work for you for whatever reason, than to sort of get into this process where you are sort of stuck with a decision that you wouldn't want. So if at the end of all of this, you say, I'm ready to go, I want to participate, and whether it's this year or next year, or even the year after, the deadline has been the same. It's been December 15th since essentially the first year that we use the match. So you have to register via the NMS website by December 15th, in addition to any of the other application materials you submit. When you register, you'll be given a unique identifier that you submit to programs to demonstrate that you're enrolled. Many people will say, just go ahead and put that right at the top of your resume, or there will be sections of application submission where you'll need to put in your match number. After interviews and sort of post-rank submission, there's about a 10-day period between when the rank process closes and when match day is. So when those results are revealed. So match day is historically in late April. It is usually the third or fourth Friday in April. And again, that's consistent across all programs. So all programs in North America are participating in the same time frame, which is really different from other graduate programs. Often there's rolling admissions or spring admission or anything like that. And that does not exist in genetic counseling at this point in time. So everyone receives their results and learns where they're going on the same day by 12 p.m. Eastern Standard Time in late April. And that comes by email. Programs don't get a heads up. No single person gets sort of the information before anybody else. So as an applicant, you receive an email that says, congratulations, this is where you've matched and this is your track. Or we're sorry to say that you didn't match at this time. Programmatically, we receive one email that says, here are the people who have matched to all of your tracks. So we get to see the whole cohort at the same time. Because match requires an additional process, there is a fee that's associated for it. That fee is sort of assessed and scaled on an annual basis. It has been $100 for the past couple of years. I know there's a move to bring it down to $90, but that is an additional fee and we recognize that. So there are match fee waivers that can help to cover that fee, and that's a separate process. We will share information about how to apply for those match fee waivers via the website, and I believe every other program will as well. So we have a meeting next week to determine the criteria and how many of those match waivers are available, but there are waivers available through AGCPD. Okay, so that was a whole lot of information about the match and some of the admissions processes in general. So at this point, I want to take a moment and just sort of like pull it all back. So we've got all this data and information. And I think the question really is, is this the right time for you, right? Is this the right time for you? Is it the right career path for you? Are you feeling like you're ready to go? Even though I have this last in my slide set, it is absolutely not last in the process. It's truly one of the most important parts of this question. If you don't know why you're doing what you're doing for yourself, why are you choosing to do this? then you're going to sort of end up wasting time spinning your wheels. You might end up someplace you don't want to be. When you figure out that why, it comes through in all of your materials. It will come through in your personal statement. It will come through in your resume. It will come through absolutely in your interviews, right? So that you'll be able to not only understand that part for yourself, but be able to speak to it on your behalf, to communicate that to somebody else. These are super critical to have that understanding about yourself. So a couple places to start. So I have here just a few questions to consider and reflect on. And remember that reflection is not just thinking about the answer to the question, right? So not just thinking about it and trying to identify an answer and saying like, yep, I got the answer, but it's also considering why you feel the way that you do, right? Understanding that piece of why do I feel this way, helps you to understand your values. And understanding your values and what's important to you will help direct you in places that will be best for you. And then it'll overall be best fit for the program. And I mean, just in general, all other areas of life. So I think it's important to assess your priorities. What are your priorities? What are they? What is it? What do you want? What do you want out of this in general? But what do you want in a program? What do you want in a cohort? What do you want in a learning experience? And then not just what do you want, but why do you want it? What do you know about yourself that says, if I have a program or I'm in a cohort that is XYZ, I think that's going to be best for me because, right? Like, what is it about that learning environment that is helpful to you, or motivates you, or drives you, or maximizes your strengths? And what are your strengths? Or helps to mitigate some of the things that maybe are challenges for you, which is totally fine. We all have them. So what does that look like? What do you need to be successful, right? Like, what are the components in your life? Maybe your personal life, your academic life, your home life. What does that look like for you to be successful? What sort of environment is good for you? If you're an undergrad or you're sort of recently out of undergrad, I think it's really important to ask yourself if you feel burned out about schoolwork or classes. It has been an incredibly challenging time, particularly with online learning and the pandemic and all these components. And a lot of people are feeling really frayed right now, and that's okay. So if you're feeling like, gosh, if I think about going back to school or going into a class, it makes me feel tired, it makes me feel exhausted, then I would say this isn't a good time for you, because it's going to require a lot of time and attention. And if you know that you're already feeling that way, then you might want to do something else for some period of time until you start to feel excited about the idea of getting into a classroom experience or schoolwork and studying again. Again, if you're in that undergrad position, you're asking yourself, like, do I want to go to school right away? I think I find a lot of people say like, yep, that's what I want to do. I want to finish my undergrad degree and I want to go to grad school, but they're not exactly sure why. So absolutely, you may be that person that says, yes, I want to go right away. But can you say why you want to do it other than to get it done? Because if you're trying to do it to get it done, that's going to be an uphill battle. It's going to tip towards the burnout pretty quickly. And even if you're not in that undergrad position, let's say you've been out for some number of years, is there a good time? Is this a good time for me to go, given what else is happening in my life? There's so many things that we are navigating and balancing and juggling at any given time point. Is this a good time given what's known right now? And do I have the support I need? So again, once you know about yourself, or sort of back to question 2, what do I need to be successful? Do you have those supports in place, or is there something that can or should be done that would help you in that process? So this is absolutely in no way a comprehensive list of questions, but I think it's a good place to start. And if you're not sure the answers to the questions, talk them out loud with someone. Get a friend, get a family member, and say, I'm trying to figure out the answer to this question. And these are the things I'm thinking about, and just sort of talk it out and process out loud. Or you can write if you prefer to write, whatever helps you to sort of figure that out before you start investing time and energy that we all know is precious to head in a direction that might not be the right one or the right time for you. So if you get to the end of this, you've done your self-reflecting and you're feeling, you know what, all signs are pointing to go. Then sort of your next step is to identify schools you want to apply to. You can do that through the AGCPD website or the ACGC website. And I'm going to give a ton more about that during our next session, just to sort of do it justice. Then the national data, just sort of out of, if you're curious, indicates that most people who end up enrolling end up applying to between 4 and 6 schools. And that 4 to 6, there's not a good sort of differentiator between 4 and 6 because the data, when it was gathered, was already categorical. So that's not ideal. But there doesn't appear to be a dramatic advantage to applying to more than 6 schools. And so I think some people look and they say, oh, 51 schools, if I really want to go, I need to apply to 8, 10, 12, 15 schools. That is incredibly expensive. It's a lot of time and effort. And there's really not any data that shows that there's benefit to that. So I think everyone is much better off trying to identify a core number of schools that they're very interested in and working with those programs on an individual level to make sure that they're tailoring their materials, that there truly is a good fit. Because if it's a good fit for you and it's a good fit for the program, that's going to come through and that will help to sort of elevate your application. So then you need to make sure that you register for the match. Again, that needs to be done by December 15th, and that's through the NMS website. And then start taking a look through your experiences. Take a look at the things you've done. Take a look at the things that you've got coming up in the next several months. And if there's anything that you identify that might be a hole, and again, we're going to talk a ton more about this, I think, during our experiences and resumes section, then go ahead and start scheduling that. So you want to make sure that you can get things on your resume, not just to get them on your resume, but so that you can speak to it during interviews, right? Anything on your resume is something that is fair game for questions. And so people will be asking you about your perspectives on different experiences you've had. So if there's something more that you want to do, go ahead and start doing it now. You don't have to wait until later in the year to do it. I think it's also a good idea to start thinking about who might be a good reference for you. And references are generally people who know you well enough that they can speak to different components of your background. I'm happy to talk more about this again in a future session, but in general, it's very helpful to share information about the field of genetic counseling with the person that you want to be your reference writer. And that's so that that person can assess, what they know about you, what your strengths are, and see where the overlap with the field is so that they can speak to that. It sort of helps to make a really powerful letter. So if you're not sure who those people are, again, start asking around, hey, who do you think would be a good person, to speak to my academic achievements, or to talk to, speak to who or how I am outside of the classroom setting, and start thinking about those and make sure that you give those folks that you want to ask to be references plenty of time to pull together letters for you. So that's the bulk of the material that I put together for this particular session. Our next session is August 25th, and that's going to be identifying and selecting graduate programs. And then in early September, I've got sort of the materials piece. We get a ton of questions on, what are experiences? How do I compile a resume? And I have a lot of opinions and pieces of advice to share about that. And then we'll talk about sort of personal statements and letters of recommendation in the middle of October. And then if somebody has very specific questions related to the program itself, I'm happy to do that. We'll have just sort of an open Q&A in November. So at this point, what I'm going to do is I'm going to stop the recording so that if you are interested in sort of engaging and asking questions directly, that you can do that without being worried about being on the recording. And